one of the admins here at Educators for Equity. Today I wanted to talk to you about creating cultural context for your novel. Last week Stephanie did a great job talking about what you do after you have your diverse library. So you've got all these books, what now? You can check out her video on the YouTube if you haven't already. I'll link it below. Creating cultural context for your novel is important whether you're teaching little guys like Stephanie or bigger guys like me. So my library looks a little different than her library might, but it doesn't mean that it's less important for her to create context than it is for me. So today what I want to talk to you about is how we do that. There's a lot of research and academic stuff that I could get into, but you guys probably didn't major in English for a reason. So I'm going to keep it really high level and talk to you about different types of context and why they're important to include when you are introducing a novel. But I'm also going to show you real world stuff, like what I do to build background knowledge, create that context, to enrich it, to supplement it, let kids explore it in a way that doesn't involve reading an article. I know that's crazy for a reading teacher, but trust me, it helps. First with the academic stuff. There's lots-ish of different types of context. There's the author context, which is the mindset, world, society the author is writing their story in. And then there's the reader's context, the mindset, society, situation I'm existing in. That's gonna be important, especially when you are teaching diverse literature, because they might be different than their readers. And for a lot of you, I know building that diverse library is on purpose. You want to have authors for diverse backgrounds, and you want the novels that your kiddos are reading to do the same. Real talk. It is not the job of your students of color to create the context for your novel. I'll say it again. It is not the job of your students of color to create the context for your book. If while you're reading, they want to volunteer information, hopefully you guys did an awesome job setting up your classroom culture and they feel comfortable and safe and they want to share, to enrich the conversation, to help people understand that it's not as simple even as a book might make it seem. Great, right? That's the best we can hope for as a teacher. All right. So that's authors and readers context, societal context, what kind of society does the character live in? Also, what kind of society was the book written in? Because sometimes, you know, books are allegories and they might have been written during a certain time, but talking about a different time. Salem witch trials, anybody? There is also ideological context. We have historical stuff. If the story is set in a certain time, you need to make sure you explain that certain time to your students. Especially if you're teaching books from different cultures, I don't think that we need to say that, well, I'm not teaching Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, so I don't need to spend that much time. I'm doing The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, and these kids live in that time. It doesn't matter. Talk about what's going on in the world today. People protesting around the world for Black lives. Talk about defunding the police. But you need to do all of that in a way that is safe for your students and a way that is not singling anybody out. That's not something you want to do. And I'll go ahead and say this here too. If you happen to be in an all-white school, because they exist, you need to especially create that context because you don't want to let microaggressions slip through or micro invalidations. You know, you want to make sure that what you're seeing and hearing your students say and do is not perpetuating white supremacy. You want to make sure they understand that, you know, her going to private school, her parents sending her there, why that's important, why she would act one way at the private school and act a different way in her neighborhood, why it's a big deal like that her parents stay in that neighborhood. And it's just, anyway. So then what did we talk about? We talked about author, we talked about the reader, we talked about society, we talked about history, we talked about ideological. Then obviously there's cultural context. If you're teaching a book about a different culture, Other Words for Home, for instance, there's probably some stuff in here you need to explain because, you know, it's not as obvious as the black-white divide. We are now talking about Middle Eastern people, and Middle Eastern people are often seen as terrorists, and that's obviously not at all what Middle Eastern people are. So you need to make sure you're taking time to explain that kind of stuff. I feel like there's probably a lot of other context stuff that I could talk to you about, but again, if you didn't major in English, you know. What I want to do is talk about how that looks in the classroom, okay? There are some websites that I use all the time. I love Crash Course. Crash Course is such an engaging way for students to access information that they don't really need to like memorize, but need to be exposed to in order to understand a story, especially if it's set somewhere else in a different place, a different time. If we're talking about different people. I use TED Talks. I love TED Talks. I love TED Ed. There's so many different perspectives you can get from there, and it's, you know, it's one of those mirror window things. It's a lot easier to see and hear somebody who experienced it. For supplemental reading materials, I use Common Lit. The great thing about Common Lit is you can get data from it and you track it and it tells you what standard each question is, and I think that's really useful, especially if you're doing data chats, which hopefully you are. Common Lit has sets of articles that go with novels already. So if you're using one of those articles, it's already done for you. It tells you at what point in the story to read it. Like, oh, after you read the first 3 chapters and this event happens, read this article and then link this article to what happened in the story in this kind of way. And obviously you can change it to whatever you want it to be, but I just think it's really helpful because you get the standard-based alignment in the articles. So a lot of the newer diverse library books might not be in there, but you can also look by theme. So if you're trying to find books about coming of age, about finding your voice, they have all these different topics that you can just look for like that. So the third thing I was going to talk about was building context through enrichment activities. I love sticky notes. I use sticky notes all the time. Hush, when we start that book, I have police, youth, and bridges on a sticky note, like the big ones, and I put them up on the board, and then I have the kids take their sticky notes. You see this word, what do you think about that? And I have them put on a sticky note, and like if it's positive, make it green. If it's negative, make it red. And then they put it up, have awesome conversations and surprising conversations. I let the conversations happen organically, and I think that's the best kind of learning and the best kind of context that can happen for kids. If you've spent the time creating that safe space for your students to talk about things and know that it's all from a place of understanding and seeking to learn more, a culture they are unfamiliar with, then these conversations can happen. I also use board games a lot. I think that they're so fantastic. So now I'm going to walk you through things that I do in my class. So I'll use books that I actually use in class, and I will talk to you a little bit about how I create the context or enrich the context. Like, it's not always about getting it started, which again, I mostly use Crash Course and TED Talks and PBS documentaries. Teaching Tolerance, of course, has like a ton of excellent stuff, and they have awesome documentaries that are grounded in fact. But I'm going to kind of like walk you through right now is specific to the novels I'm going to show you. You'll see how all of my rambling looks in practice. When I taught senior English, Beowulf was on that list. I love Beowulf, but I understand that it's more difficult in Vikings, and you kids are usually on board with all the like, I'm gonna slay a dragon stuff that happens. When I switched to 5th grade, I had the gifted 5th grade class, and Beowulf was on that list of novels I could teach, and boy was I pumped because I could like just whoop, slide that into our class. I'm teaching this book to 5th graders different than I'm teaching it to my 12th graders. For them, I would use supplemental material, Guts and Glory. It's fun, it's easy to read. While I'm here, Course Hero, when you have a book that is on Course Hero, one, they have super sweet infographics, which you can like print out and then hang up or pass out to your kids or show online if that's what we're doing. I don't know. Their summary videos are awesome as well. So Course Hero, I would check that out. Also, Beowulf has Common Lit too, so I could just beep, beep, beep. So that's kind of like how I broke it down, was I did it based on how they said that they would break it down on Common Lit, and then we would do that, and we'd do the articles when they hit. Before we read the text, we watched the summary of what was about to happen. And Course Hero is like 2 or 3 minutes long. It's not very long. It was animated, so it was visually engaging. Help them understand the difficult language. And that, I think, is something that's important about context too, is if they can't understand it, it doesn't really matter what you're doing. Making sure you're building the context in a way that the kids get what they're reading. And if it is a more difficult book like Beowulf, and we're gonna get to Shakespeare in a second, there's ways to make things relevant to your kids that are gonna make them wanna read, and that's really what this is all about. I also use games that were quick. So we had like Bottle Cap Vikings, so they were able to play this and it was fun. But we also used Vikings, and this one was fun because like, it's a puzzle and it's logic, and then you had to get from like one side of the puzzle to the other side of the puzzle, like get that ship, like this yellow ship needs to go over there, but the things only twist certain ways. They would just get so like into it and they'd want to do it, and then they'd be like, man, if I can't get like my green ship to the green triangle, how did Beowulf possibly swim across the sea and fight Sea Monsters? It was real cool to hear him bring in the story to these activities which seem like totally pointless but really help enrich their understanding of the story. There's that. Now, but I hate Shakespeare, which I know, I'm an English teacher. What do you mean you hate Shakespeare? I'm not a big fan. I'll tell you, I had a real hard time teaching Brit Lit because trying to find Brit Lit that's not written by white people is hard. I use graphic novels and I think they're fantastic, and you know what? It's no fear Shakespeare, and so it was like normal language, way easier for kids to understand. Here's the thing, we're gonna read comics. Well, what's going on with comics? Let's build some context about that. Actually, I use Superman Red Sun with Beowulf over there for using comics in my class. I think it's important to explain to students why I'm using it. Comics might seem too like low for seniors. Really, it's not. If they're gonna read it and they're gonna understand it, then that's what I care about. So much more going on with comics. So I take time to use books that explain comics and not just white comic. We read a Batman one, so I use a Batman one. I got like the kind of history of it with the Superman one. Is that the Superman one? Yeah, 2 Superman ones. Because I think the psychology of it is cool because of like this, it lets kids see that they can like bring in these other topics, that it's relevant. At the time at the school, I had only a few black students because it was mostly Greek Orthodox. I purposely used a super black one to show my black students that I saw them and I wanted them to see themselves. It mattered, they matter. Another important point teachers should remember is that it doesn't have to be revolutionary. Your effort in the classroom when you go back, like I get, we're all pumped up right now. We're like, yeah, equity, let's do this. The status quo is no longer quo. But it doesn't have to be just like this monumental task. If you can just do something simple sometimes, like that's just really means so. Heads up. That's how I use comics. I don't just create context for the story, I create context for the genre, and I think that's important, especially if you're doing poetry stuff. So many of these new books are written in verse, and I think that's awesome. And I use slam poetry stuff. I've been using Tupac. I actually get in trouble for using Tupac, but I use it anyway. Anything that connects the students with who they are. And when you can bring that into like an academic thing, you're like, hey man, you know, Tupac, and I was like, what do you know about Tupac? Listen, he didn't just write rap. No, we could have a whole nother conversation about his rap game and how he changed it. He also wrote poetry, and listen to this poetry and look at how this poetry is relevant. This guy wrote these poems which are being used as a standard part of the curriculum now. Like, that's important. You guys might not see that because you're 13 years old, but I'm telling you, that's a big deal. Building context for how it applies in the world. Creating cultural context is important for your novels, absolutely. And you should build your background knowledge, use supplemental materials that bring in different viewpoints, use enrichment activities that relate to the actual text and the topics in that text, but do not limit yourself, and more importantly, do not limit your students to just the context that is the academics. Bring in the context of food. Oh, we're reading this book. Have you ever had this kind of food? Well, let's order some of that food. I feed people all the time. The more holistic and the more natural you can make your context seem, the more natural it will be. And if your student reads something and they get excited about something and they link it to something like a music artist or a movie or an actor or another poem, if you're like really doing your job well, bring that in. Absolutely bring that in. They can see how this story or this character relates to their life. That context is going to just be so much more full and rich, and really it just might get them wanted to read more. That's all I want as a reading teacher, is you to be excited about reading. That's a lot of rambling. Hopefully you found something useful. Again, I would check out Stephanie's Building a Diverse Library, What Do You Do Now video from last week. You can't just buy all these books, put them on a shelf, and expect kids to do anything with them. You need to create the context, in her case, with the labels, help them understand, oh, these books are about world changers. These books are about tough choices. These books are about whatever. Thanks for listening.